When you send over your research on high-functioning autism in adults, it really struck me how important this topic is. And it just doesn't seem to be getting the attention it deserves, especially when you look at the numbers.
Right. It's a really important topic.
We're talking about 1 in 54 adults in the U.S. diagnosed with ASD.
Yeah, it's a big number.
That's huge. That's a significant portion of the population, and it really underscores why we need to deep dive into this.
And what's really interesting is that a lot of those adults, they don't get diagnosed until way later in life.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, imagine figuring out at 42 that you've been living in a world that wasn't really built for the way your brain works.
It's like you've been driving this car your whole life, and then suddenly someone hands you the manual, and you're like, oh, there were buttons for that. But it begs the question, why is there such a delay in diagnosis? And honestly, why don't we know more about HFA in adults in general?
Well, I think a big part of it, honestly, is the funding for research. I was looking at some figures from the Autism Society, and a few years back, they found that only $21 million out of $287 million in NIH funding for autism research, only that much went to studies on adults.
Wow. So we're talking less than 10% to understand something that affects a significant portion of adults.
Exactly.
That's a huge imbalance.
And that creates a domino effect, right? Because less research means less awareness, which then makes it harder to advocate for more funding.
It's a vicious cycle. And it probably doesn't help that there's this misconception that autism is like a childhood condition.
Oh, absolutely.
Like you just, poof, grow out of it when you turn 18.
Right, like it just disappears. But the reality is that high-functioning autism, it's a lifelong thing. It doesn't just go away. And it affects every aspect of an adult's life, work, relationships, mental health, you name it.
So it's not just about, needing a little extra support here and there.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that this is something that impacts you every single day.
Every single day.
And that makes the lack of diagnostic tools specifically for adults even more troubling, don't you think?
For sure.
I mean, it's like trying to understand a complex machine using an outdated manual.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of the criteria we use now are based on how autism presents in children. And while some of those things stay the same, adults with HFA, they've often spent years, adapting and masking their challenges.
To figure out ways to cope.
Exactly. They develop coping mechanisms that they maybe didn't have as kids, or they might not fit that kind of textbook image of autism.
So they end up falling through the cracks.
Right.
Not because they don't need the support, but because the tools to identify those needs are just, they're not quite there yet.
Yeah, we have a long way to go.
And it's because of that disconnect, that lack of understanding and early diagnosis, that a lot of adults with HFA end up facing these really specific challenges.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Challenges in the workplace, social situations, even with their own mental well-being, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It affects every single area of life.
It really does. Let's talk about the workplace for a minute. You have all these incredibly talented, bright individuals with HFA, and they're more than capable of doing the work, but traditional work environments, they're just not set up to support them.
Yeah, they can be tough.
It seems almost counterintuitive sometimes.
Yeah.
Right? Like you can have someone who's a coding whiz, building incredible software, but put them in a team meeting and they're completely overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Or dreading that client presentation.
Right, exactly. And it's not even always the big stuff. Sometimes it's something as simple as sensory overload in an open office. The lights are buzzing, people are talking, phones are ringing, and it's too much.
Right.
It's hard to focus when your environment feels like it's attacking you.
Absolutely. And then you add in all these social cues and unspoken rules that we often take for granted in a workplace setting.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a whole other layer of complexity to navigate.
Right. And it can be really tough because if you're not picking up on those unspoken rules, it's easy to misinterpret things.
Exactly.
People might think you're being rude or you're not a team player when really you're just processing things differently.
It's like you're constantly second-guessing yourself, wondering, did I say the right thing?
Yeah.
Am I reading this situation correctly? It's exhausting.
It is. It really is. And unfortunately, that social piece, it doesn't just stay at work, right? It spills over into every other aspect of your life.
It does.
And that's a big reason why we see higher rates of social isolation and loneliness among adults with HFA.
Which is so hard because it's one of those invisible struggles. It's not always obvious to others why someone might be withdrawn or seem a little bit hesitant in social situations.
Exactly. And because it's not visible, it's easy for people to misunderstand those behaviors. Like they might think someone's being standoffish or unfriendly when in reality, they're just trying to cope with the world that feels overwhelming to them.
It's heartbreaking, really, when you think
Right.
about it. And on top of all of that, the workplace challenges, the social anxiety, it takes a toll on mental health.
It does. It definitely does. We see much higher rates of anxiety, depression, sometimes even PTSD in adults with HFA.
And what makes it even more complicated, I think, is that even when individuals with HFA do seek help, those traditional therapeutic approaches, they don't always work, do they?
No, not always. You have to remember, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Right.
We need therapists who are trained to recognize the specific ways that anxiety or depression might show up in someone with HFA.
So it's not just about access to care, it's about access to the right kind of care.
Exactly.
And having that understanding that there are sensory sensitivities, social anxieties, all of these things that might need a slightly different approach in therapy.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's as simple as explaining a concept more literally or breaking down social situations step by step.
It's about creating that safe space where someone feels like they can truly be themselves without judgment, where they're not just a diagnosis, but a whole person.
I think that's a great way to put it.
It's easy to get bogged down by all the challenges,
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that there's hope, too. We've talked about the need for more research, greater awareness, specialized support. But what does that actually look like in practice? What does the path forward look like?
Well, I think the first step is moving beyond just identifying the problems and actually starting to talk about solutions. And the good news is that there are some really promising developments happening. Remember that funding gap we were talking about earlier?
Yeah.
Imagine if we could just redirect even a small portion of that money towards research on HFA in adults.
The impact could be huge.
Huge.
I mean, think about the breakthroughs we could see in diagnosis and treatment if researchers had the resources they needed.
Absolutely. Increased funding wouldn't just lead to new discoveries, it would also attract more brilliant minds to the field.
Right, like a snowball effect.
Exactly. But it's not just about the scientific community either, right? We also need to raise awareness and understanding in society as a whole.
Oh, absolutely. That's key. And we're actually seeing some incredible progress on that front. Social media, for example, has been a game changer. It's given adults with HFA a platform to share their stories and connect with each other in ways that just weren't possible before.
It's amazing to see. There are these incredible social media campaigns, collaborations with influencers, online communities, all of it helping to destigmatize autism and challenge those old stereotypes.
It's about putting a human face on what can sometimes feel like a very clinical diagnosis.
Exactly, because these are real people with real lives and real experiences.
And those stories are so powerful.
They are, and that human connection is so important for driving change. But another crucial piece of the puzzle is education.
Oh, for sure.
We need to be teaching people about autism from a young age, and that includes accurate, up-to-date information in schools, in workplaces, everywhere.
So that it's not this big mystery, right?
Exactly. It should be about understanding, acceptance, and creating a world where everyone feels supported.
Imagine a workplace where employers recognize and value the unique strengths that individuals with HFA bring to the table. A workplace where differences are celebrated, not feared.
I love that.
That's the kind of future we should be striving for.
Absolutely.
This whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening for me. I've learned so much. And while it's clear that there's still a long way to go, what gives me hope is that the conversation is finally starting to change. We're moving away from those outdated narratives and embracing the complexity and the diversity of the autism spectrum. And that shift in perspective, that's where real change begins.
I couldn't agree more. The more we learn about autism, the more we realize how much we don't know. But by asking questions, by challenging our assumptions, by listening to autistic voices, we can create a more inclusive and supportive world for everyone.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Remember, even small acts of understanding and allyship can make a world of difference.